So today we're going to be talking about the fifth commandment, which is the Sabbath day. And we start off by looking actually at the place where the Sabbath day has its philosophical origins in Genesis chapter 2. Well, Genesis chapter 1 refers to it briefly where it says, on the seventh day God rested. But Genesis chapter 2 expands on that concept. And the author of Genesis, most likely Abraham, says, thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. Yes, sir.
Abraham?
Sorry, Moses.
No, Moses.
Yeah, Moses. My bad. Thank you.
Okay.
I mean, you never know. But so,
We know it's Moses.
all right. And all their hosts. By the seventh day, God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. Okay, so a philosophical question for a philosophical discussion. Does God need rest?
No.
No. God is not finite or defined by limitations, and the only reason we need rest is because we are limited. We get tired. We need to sleep, literally, we need to sleep. The absence of sleep over a period of time can cause insomnia and it's eventually actually psychological disorders. God doesn't have those problems. God is capable of operating, all the time, paying attention all the time, and he doesn't need rest. So why does God rest on the seventh day? Why did God rest on the seventh day? Okay.
Why did God say
The one that's
Jesus?
here right now, I signed, okay?
I wasn't prepared for that today. I'm sorry. You're going to have to answer that one yourself.
Because we needed him.
Okay.
And I think the same principle holds true here. God rested to bring into focus our needs and set an example for us on how we should behave, both in terms of physical rest and I think also sanctified holy rest, devoting a certain percentage of our time exclusively to God.
Okay. Now, in God's case, of course, in a sense, I guess it's kind of interesting. I never really thought of it quite that way. The way you said it, devoting a certain percentage of our time to God. God is essentially devoting a percentage. Well, no, I mean, he's devoting that seventh day to himself, to resting for himself. So that's an interesting concept. So, Sylvia.
Well, God also said that he didn't make the Sabbath, he made the Sabbath for the people.
Yes.
Because then he had made the people also to worship him. So they have to have the time and not working and worshiping him. And that's why God made that Sabbath.
Yeah, we actually see Jesus when he's questioned by the Pharisees over, I forget whether he was healing or whether they were eating or something, but he's questioned by them, and his response is that the man wasn't made for the Sabbath was made for man. The Sabbath day is something that exists to be a blessing to mankind. I apologize, my shirt feels like it's turned up, but it's not. So I'm just going to have to deal with that. Anyway, so today we're going to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
I was just going to, there's definitely some kind of spiritual application of the Sabbath day because of the way the rest is treated in Hebrew. Where talk the
Sabbath rest for God.
Sabbath rest and God's rest.
Right.
So I mean there has to be some spiritual relationship for it. That probably like Ken just said, it's a time that they were to dedicate everything to God. I mean no work, they were to recognize that God was God.
Right.
It just seems like that Hebrews is kind of ties them together anyway.
Well, we're going to talk about the Hebrews passage as we go along in this, so we will visit that more. It is worth noting that despite my earlier faux pas, the author of Genesis was almost certainly Abraham. Sorry, there it is again, Moses. I'm having real problems today. Wow, Moses, almost certainly Moses. So at least that time I caught it. Anyway, so he is almost certainly Moses. Now consider this for a moment, okay? So the guy who's writing down and saying, the seventh day God completed his work and rested, is the same guy who's being given laws that include honoring the Sabbath and keeping it holy. So it's very likely that the emphasis that we see here in Genesis on this seventh day is given to Moses in order to help him to understand the significance of the Sabbath day's rest, that he's going to be also commanding the people. Perhaps doing it in the reverse order, in fact, that the commandment for the Sabbath has already been created, and in the course then of writing down this book of history that took place before he was even on the scene, he's writing this down. So it's kind of an interesting thing, because we don't usually think of it in those terms. We think, well, this happened all that long time ago, and then Moses was given the law after that, and that's all true. But the emphasis placed on the Sabbath day wasn't written down until the same basic time that he was writing down the laws, including the law about the Sabbath. So God is choosing to emphasize something about creation when he tells Moses what to write down that ties into and amplifies the ideas related to the commandment that he's giving him. Now that's a unique feature that God has, to be able to see all of that at one time. But I think it's important for us to be mindful that this is the timing in which these concepts were actually put down in writing and kept, for memorials kind of purposes. Jerry?
I guess I've looked at it, the seventh day in the creation, a little not quite as fancy as you. I've just read it as God's finished. That he was through. He had done the creation. It was finished. And that's why he rested.
Yeah, but look at verse 3. He blessed it and he sanctified it because he had finished it.
Well,
Yeah.
that's good.
So, so yes, there's a little bit more going on than just, you're right, the term rest could simply mean come to a stop.
Yeah.
When we talk about a vehicle, for example.
I'm sure I've not looked at
But
it
yeah,
properly.
when we look at, as Ken points out, the third verse that talks about blessing and sanctifying it, when we talk about what you already brought up, the Hebrew writer talking about it in the context of the bigger spiritual picture, it's pretty clear that there's something going on here. And then also, like I said, consider that this is a story that's being told to Moses at around the same time that he's writing the commandment, and the commandment references, or other places where the commandment is discussed, reference the day of the seventh day of creation. All of this looks like a very concerted and deliberate and specific effort on God's part to make clear that this is a bigger picture thing than just, I want you guys to take a break once a week, everybody deserves a day off kind of a thing. So I think that there's my point in talking about the point at which this is written down is not to undermine the significance of this having happened in the days of creation, but rather to say God is using the fact that he's timeless and knows all these things that are happening at the same time to plan and to combine together these linked concepts and events so that he can then make a bigger point. Let me do Steve and then I'll come over to Ken.
Well, it's interesting to me, sanctify means set apart. So God set this day apart. And he said in the commandments, keep it holy.
Yeah.
And so it is a day for mankind to reflect, I think, in those days. And so God didn't rest, he didn't need rest, but it was a declaration of, okay, I'm finished with this creation, and now I sanctify the last day of the week.
Yeah. So we're talking about the point at which the creation comes to an end, but then because there's this seventh day, then there is this additional concept that's added to that. So, all right, Ken, and then I'll go over to Sylvia.
I think the really important thing for us is you take this, which is under the patriarchal age, predates the law. You take the Sabbath day in the law, and then you take the comments we're going to look at in the New Testament. God is establishing a principle for us that goes throughout time. And is important even today. Not the seventh day of the week. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But this principle of a day that is sanctified and holy and set apart for God. And we could spend a whole week or two talking about how and when and why the transition occurred. From Saturday to Sunday.
We'll do some of that later.
Yeah, later.
Not today.
No.
Okay, Sylvia.
And Job is the oldest book in the Bible. It's actually written first. And if you see, and his sons would go and feast in their houses, each on his appointed day,
Wait, you're
and
telling me
would
that
send and invite their three
Job.
sisters to eat and drink with them. So it was when the days of feasting had run their course, that Job would send and sanctify them. So a day is already set, it doesn't say Sabbath, but that's what
Okay,
it
that's an interesting point. I think there might be some different ways to interpret that particular passage, but these concepts are very, very old. We don't see any examples in Genesis of the patriarchs specifically setting aside a day of rest. In one sense, that is probably because, well, number one, because that the Sabbath itself was not created, and that terminology was not created until Sinai. In another sense, it may simply be because how Abraham and his kind approached it would be different than the Israelites might. There's some differences in terms of what you can do when you have control of an entire land versus what you have to do when you are living on somebody else's land. You can't afford to take a day off and just say, oh, things will work themselves out. You know, pretty soon the cattle are going to be grazing in somebody else's yard, and they're going to be angry, and you're going to be at war. So you have to apply the principles in different ways, I think, sometimes. And certainly before there is a hard and fast command, the one we're going to look at in a second here, you have a lot more flexibility in how that's going to look, whether it's what happened in Job or whatever Abraham and Isaac and Jacob did. So, okay, we're going to talk today about, and for several weeks I'm sure, given how long we spent on the first slide, remember. Anybody know what that particular phrase is the beginning of?
The 5th of November.
There we go. So there's somebody who's a comic book fan. Probably. So what is the 5th of November anyway?
Is when Oliver Cromwell was...
Good try, but not quite.
Not
You're
quite.
on the right track. It's not an American holiday. It's actually a British holiday called Guy Fawkes Day.
Guy Fawkes.
Sometimes people refer to it as the British version of Independence Day. That's a misnomer for a number of reasons, not the least of which that it failed, whereas our Independence Day actually succeeded. So, which they don't want to talk about that so much. But Guy Fawkes was a revolutionary who was opposed to the king and the parliamentary system, and he loaded up basically a wagon with explosives and trundled it down underneath the Houses of Parliament, intending to detonate it and basically blow up Parliament. He was prevented from doing that at kind of the last minute when the plot was discovered, and so he was taken into custody and ultimately executed. But there is a saying, a child's poem in Great Britain, remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot, and it goes on from there. But anyway, the idea that we don't forget important things is something that is a fundamental truth for humanity. It's unfortunately a truth that we oftentimes forget, which is ironic. But we will think about the idea, you know, one of the things that we talk about is those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. We talk about ideas like that. And a lot of times we learn lessons from things that happened. In many cases, they're the wrong lessons. One of the things that God does in the Ten Commandments is he makes it really clear what lessons the Israelites are supposed to learn a lot of the time, by telling them, this is what you're supposed to remember. This is what you're supposed to remember. And in the case of the Sabbath day, he tells them to remember the Sabbath day. Exodus chapter 20, starting in verse 8, during the course of the Ten Commandments, he says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Holy and sanctified are slightly different words, but for all intents and purposes, they mean the same thing. Set apart, keep it separate, keep it set apart. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So we have this law, this rule that's given to them, that they are to remember the Sabbath day. When he says remember the Sabbath day, I think it's kind of a dual context concept. Number one, they're supposed to remember that each Sabbath day is a day that's dedicated to the Lord. But they're also supposed to remember the significance of the Sabbath day, why that's important, because it is the day that God rested, the day that God set aside as being sanctified and made it holy. They're supposed to remember that, and that is the reason for the Sabbath day, not just some arbitrary one out of every 7 days everybody takes a day off. So he says, remember it. He says, for 6 days you do your work. The seventh day you don't do any work. Now, later on, the Pharisees would come up with a very convoluted series of rules about how much work you could do, how much you couldn't do, and a lot of it went from looking at incidences in the Old Testament, in the first 5 books of the Bible, of where something was done on the Sabbath, where on a Sabbath day they marched a certain distance, or on a Sabbath day they did, one thing or another, whatever it was, and so it kind of it had, I don't know if I want to call it exceptions exactly, but it had a meaning. The idea of doing no work had a meaning. There was still something that was being done. An example, probably the most extreme example of all of it, what took place over the course of 7 days, fairly early on in the Israelites' national history?
Well, they had to do, the priests were almost exempt from the not working on the Sabbath day. They had to do all the sacrifices, they had to do all of the altar work and that kind of thing.
Correct. So one thing, that's different than the one I'm asking about,
Okay.
but that's a very good point.
Passover?
Now, Passover actually didn't take 7 days.
Okay.
So to go to what you're saying, one thing that didn't stop. Now, we get confused because because the Sabbath day has parallels to Sunday, to the first day, we tend to sometimes make the mistake of thinking that because Sunday is our worship day and we came together and worshiped, that was the day that the Israelites got together and worshiped and sacrificed animals and stuff like that. And that's not true. The Sabbath day was not a day of sacrifice specifically, but the temple never stopped sacrificing at least some. There were always certain sacrifices that had to be made every day, including the Sabbath day. And if someone came to the temple offering up, a guilt offering or something like that on the Sabbath, it would have been sacrificed as well. So that's one example of a situation where 365 days a year, there was things going on. Ken?
In fact, on the Sabbath, they had twice as many daily offerings that were required as the other
Right,
6 days.
right. It wasn't like the whole community got together and did the sacrifices. The priests did a lot of these things. And here again, this is an aspect of the temple worship that we sometimes get mixed up about because we're used to the idea of our Sundays. But the temple kind of functioned on its own to a significant extent, and people only came there either when they needed a sacrifice, or maybe if they were in Jerusalem already for something else and they wanted to go to the temple or the tabernacle, whatever it was. They didn't go there actively like every Sunday or something like that. Now, there were certain holidays where every male was expected to go, but those were not necessarily on a Sabbath day. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about how those holidays typically took on the characteristics of the Sabbath. That's a different issue. But
Back to your question,
Yeah.
going to Jericho.
I am. So, the story of Jericho. Consider what happens in the story of Jericho. They march around the city one time each day for 6 days, and then the 7th day, they march around it 7 times, the walls collapse, and they invade. Now, there's no saying that 7th day was the Sabbath, that's not my point. But at some point along in there, if you do 7 days in a row, math tells me at least that you're going to hit a Sabbath, right? I'm not wrong about that, am I? So, at some point, they marched all the way around that city, which was no small thing to do. So that was one of the places where the Pharisees pulled out and said, clearly it's okay to march this far. Now, is there anything potentially flawed about that logic?
Well, there was it actually had not been ordered until Exodus 20.
Yeah, but Jericho was way after Exodus 20.
Well,
Exodus 20 is right
yeah,
after, shortly, it's like months after they come out of
Right.
Egypt. Yeah, you're getting turned around on that. That can happen though, so don't worry. Okay, were you
Yeah,
going to
it's
say?
very flawed, okay, when you look at that kind of logic, because that had nothing to do with the Sabbath day. God has told them how to conquer this enemy, and God is in charge of the Sabbath. And so he can tell them to do whatever he wants
Right.
on whatever day he thinks they need to do it, and they're okay.
Right.
But to try to draw out of that something where you're going to bind that on everybody for all time,
Right.
doesn't pass the common sense test, not the logic test.
Common sense did not get in the way of a lot of the Pharisees' thinking. Logic, maybe a little bit more, but common sense was not something that troubled them greatly. So, all right, so let's go kind of work our way across here. Barbara.
Okay, didn't the number 7 in the Bible, isn't that supposed to be complete?
Yes.
Everything is complete. I mean,
Yes.
just like, the creation was completed by,
Right.
and all that, and, that would be, and if it's following through with everything, everything is complete on the seventh.
Right.
Or-
And I've said this before, God is kind of a numbers guy.
Yeah.
And it's always interesting to think, okay, so when we do things, cause and effect takes place, like you do things and it causes other things to happen. You have an idea, you carry out, it makes things happen. Maybe after you do things, then you have an idea about a better way to do it or whatever else it is. God doesn't have cause and effect the way that we have cause and effect. So because God is timeless, everything that happens is part of a plan that's created before time is part of the issue. So what's fascinating to me is the question of, okay, did God do creation in 6 days so the seventh day could be holy because he likes numbers and 7 is the number that he wanted to make the most important number? Or did 7 become the most important number because God had decided to do creation in 6 days? See, you look at that, you go, I really can't answer that. There's no way to answer that. But there are definitely times, think about Jesus, okay? So Jesus, at certain times, Jesus fulfills prophecy just by being who he is and doing what he does, like being born in Nazareth. Being born in Bethlehem and then going and living in Nazareth. Neither of those things were things that Jesus had any direct control over in his human form. Now, he may have been influencing them before he became incarnate, but in terms of where he was born and where he lived, that was his parents' decision. And so those fulfill prophecy without him having to actually really actively do something, because that's a situation where God knew what was going to happen, and so he told the prophet to say that. But later on in Jesus' life, he deliberately does things to fulfill prophecy. So then the question becomes, did Jesus do those things because the prophecy had been said, or did Jesus do those things and knowing that he would do those things, God caused the prophecy to be said? This is where cause and effect gets all messed up. And that's kind of the same thing with these numbers things here. The 6 days and 7th day and stuff like that. Is this something that was pre-planned, or is this something where it was a side effect afterwards that 7 became so important? So anyway, all right, Steve.
Okay, so I'm trying to unwrap some of this. So in the Orthodox Jews, they call it Shabbat, right?
Yes.
Shabbat, and that's the Hebrew. Sylvie's probably the only one in the room that has practiced Shabbat, and still does.
Yes.
Still does, as a matter of conscience. And so, an interesting story, there's a very large camera company that has an internet presence and retail in New York. It's called B&H, and it's owned by Orthodox Jews, and many work for them that way. So, they close on Sunday. Saturday. They're completely closed, and they exercise the Shabbat. But you can't even order online. They shut down their...
Really?
They shut down their website, everything.
Wow.
And so even though no one's really working, you can't even place an order that, Okay, so that's an interesting thing. Some are very orthodox that way. And then we look at the Seventh-day Adventists who claim Christ, but yet still practice the Sabbath, in a sense. I think it's a misnomer to say, well, Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. I've heard that before. We don't practice the Sabbath
Correct.
on Sunday. We're not practicing a Sabbath. We come to worship and we remember Christ in the communion. And so that's completely different than what they live. And I think about Israel right now, yesterday, the Shabbat, they're firing missiles at Hamas. Are they breaking the Sabbath doing that?
Right. And the answer is no. Because going back to some of these other examples, well, first of all, we have the situation with Jericho, and there are numerous examples throughout Israel's history, biblically speaking, where they were fighting wars that took place during the Sabbath. And just because you're fighting the Philistines in Canaan doesn't mean you can go, all right, we're going to take a day off, guys, so just hang out up there, and a day from now, we'll pick this back up. And the Philistines are like, what are we, like, mentally challenged? Of course we're not going to wait for you to, so you can't, Ken's point, and that was the point I was trying to get at, I think, is very central, is it is important to understand that, as we've already said several times, the Sabbath is made for man, not the other way around. It would be self-defeating for God's people to have a limitation put on them that would basically bring to an end the existence of their nation simply because they are following this commandment. That would not make any sense. And God is perfectly capable, and we see this all the time. God makes exceptions to his own laws, to his own rules. And when he does, it's for good reasons, but there's always the exception. So you know, the Ten Commandments, we're going to get to this one later at some point, says do not murder. On the other hand, he tells the Israelites when you go into the land of Canaan, kill every living thing, basically. Not just the men, not just the soldiers in war, where there'd be even in a modern sense, there'd be a justification for doing it. Kill the women, kill the children. It's pretty hard to say that killing children isn't murder. But God has made an exception, and the exception has to do with spiritual realities and spiritual truths, and we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about it when we talk about murder, but the point is that God makes exceptions to his laws and rules when those are appropriate. And it's not as though God's laws and rules are limiting on him in the sense of, well, now I've said it, so I guess I can't undo it, you know. That's one of the misnomers of popular culture, is this idea that when some religious person speaks on God's behalf, that somehow God has to honor whatever it is he's done. You know, it's just not true. So, Ian.
Well, we're going to backtrack a little bit.
By all means.
What I was going to say was, we're talking about the Pharisees, you know, God makes an exception to the rule, and so the Pharisees are like, aha, gotcha. And now we're going to write this into law that you can march so far and blah, blah, blah on the Sabbath, and there's a workaround, because the Pharisees love to find loopholes, and they like to kind of make things up as they go, and it continuously gets them in trouble.
Right.
And I think that we could kind of take that today, right, where you see different churches and stuff kind of making up, well, this is now okay, and then this is now okay. Well, it's just going to get them into the same trouble that the Pharisees got into when they started making up the rules.
And I think that the thing that's interesting is, when you look at the Sabbath in particular, is that Jesus says a couple of things to them, beyond the one we already talked about the Sabbath being for man. He says, number one, that even under the law, it was okay if you're, you know, if you had an oxen or a son, because those are the same things. If fell into a well, you can pull them out on the Sabbath. There's no, so he says, there's the Sabbath, the rule of the Sabbath is not intended to be a hard and fast rule that has no exceptions and no compassion and no recognition of the reality of the situation. It's intended to be a mindset about spirituality. If your son falls into a well and you're like, well, we can't do anything today because it's the Sabbath, are you going to get any time focusing on God for the rest of the day? I mean, maybe you don't like your son very much, but probably not. I mean, you're going to spend the whole day, your wife's going to be nagging you, get the son out of the well. Well, again, it's the Sabbath, you know, and you're going to be sitting around obsessed and worried about it and everything else. That's not helping anybody. So obviously, there is, and we'll see as we look a little further, the Sabbath, a lot of the Sabbath was about planning for the things that you would normally have to do. But notice what I said in there, the things that you would normally have to do. You know, in the case of the Israelites gathering the manna ahead of time, in the modern context, cooking and taking care of those things ahead of time. It's not intended to deal with the things that are abnormal. Something that happens that you could not possibly have planned for or expected, something that is completely outside of the realm of what is normally going to happen. You're not expected to be ready for that and not have to do anything. We've just been invaded by all of the Arab nations around us. But it's the Sabbath day, so we're just going to hang out and wait until it's over. I think the Arab nations actually thought that's what might happen. Now, in reality, they were primarily focused in the first of those wars on the fact that the Israelis were not prepared at all for that invasion to happen. But nevertheless, that mindset of, well, we just, you know, it's happened on the Sabbath, so we can't do anything. That's not the point. The point is be ready, do your preparation, think and plan for the Sabbath. Not anything that could possibly happen is something you can't do anything about. And so that kind of thinking is very antithetical to the purpose of the Sabbath altogether. So, okay, let's go to Sylvia and then back to
It's very clear, you shall not do any ordinary work.
Yeah.
It doesn't say anything of the specials that need to be done. But your work that you get paid for and do this thing, that's the work you don't do.
Right. Yeah. So we're not talking about anything. We're talking about those kinds of special things. And by that point, then, Jesus, on several occasions, does things that the Pharisees think you're not supposed to do. That his disciples pick grain as they're walking along on the Sabbath. He heals on the Sabbath. He does a number of different things. And the point he keeps making over and over again to the Jews is not just, we always get hung up on, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. And that's part of the argument, but that's not the main argument. most of what Jesus is saying to them is, you have this hardness of heart, you have come up with your specific exceptions that have nothing to do with what's really going on, instead of recognizing that the Sabbath is about compassion, is about a good thing, an opportunity to rest. And if you make it about just figuring out some few exceptions that you can come up with, you're actually missing the point. You would be better off getting rid of your attempts to define the Sabbath in legalistic terms and simply recognizing it for what it is. And when that happens, then number one, you'd be prepared for the things that you might otherwise think you could try to get away with on the Sabbath. And number two, you wouldn't feel so angst-filled every time that you have to do something on the Sabbath that wasn't part of the plan. So he's trying to convey this idea to them, and of course the Jews, and particularly the Pharisees, never get that because they're all about legalistic righteousness. But that's what's going on here. So, okay, Jerry, and then Mark. Did you have your hand up? Or, okay, Ken maybe. Okay.
I just have always had a thought about the mother that had to change the baby's diaper on the Sabbath. That's all.
Awkward. Yeah. All right, Ken.
There are times when God's own rules and laws are in tension with each other. For example, on the Sabbath, there were lots of Jewish boys who turned 8 days old on the Sabbath, and the priest still circumcised them. That was a sign of the covenant relationship between God and his people, which obviously superseded anything God had to say about the Sabbath.
Yeah.
So God himself set up these situations
Right.
where they had things that they needed to do on the Sabbath day.
And that's
They didn't recognize those things in the way that you've described it. They just went real legalistic.
right.
And God kind of knew they were going to think of it. If you look at this and covetousness, those are the two longest commandments. God gives those, not you, not your son, not your daughter, not your wife, not your female servant,
Right.
on and on. He knew how they thought.
Yeah. Well, the only other one is he explains in great detail is idolatry. He's like, okay,
Yeah.
so I mean, when I say idols, I mean this, and I mean this, and I mean this, and I mean this, and also this, and you might think this is okay, but no, that's not okay either. It's kind of like, wow, but yeah, and this is a reality of all legal systems. There's no legal system that I know of that doesn't have tensions between competing laws at certain times, whether it's murder and self-defense, whether it's, speeding and the need to get somewhere in an urgent situation, or in some cases, the exceptions carved out for law enforcement or first responders when it comes to traffic laws, things like that. There's an inherent awareness by most people operating in a legal system, and the ones who write it especially, that there's always going to be tension between competing interests. And in our country in particular, our Constitution actually includes that awareness. Our Bill of Rights, coupled with the different aspects of in fact, the Founding Fathers went out of their way to create tension between the three branches of government to keep any one of them from becoming too powerful, which almost worked for 150 years or so. And then it didn't after that. But for a while, it was successful. So this idea of tension between rules is not something that is a flaw of the system. It is something that is unavoidable in a system, because the only other way you can do it is to literally give a rule for every single situation, which is impossible. Well, I mean, it's possible for God, but it would have been impossible for Moses to write it all down, because you can't, there's no way to do this. And that's where you get these really, really autocratic rulers, the Shahs in Iran, for example, people like Hitler and Stalin. One of the reasons, not the only reason, one of the reasons that their countries fell so far behind the rest of the world in certain ways is because no significant decision could be made without consulting the guy in charge. And the guy in charge gets tired and he needs rest and he makes bad decisions and all that kind of stuff. And because of that, when people are afraid to make decisions on their own, they're afraid that they might, get beheaded or gassed or, shot or whatever it is. You don't do anything that you're not sure what the answer is. You take it to the next guy in line, and eventually that goes before whoever's in charge. And so God doesn't want that. God is not a micromanager. That is one of the mistakes sometimes that we think when we read the law, that God is a micromanager because he made all these laws. But the fact is, they made all those laws so that he didn't have to be consulted every single time something came up. And it wasn't designed for that to be the case anyway. Now, there were definitely situations where Moses was consulted and he would go talk to God. And a lot of times it was related to disputes and things like that went on within the camp. But eventually that had to be phased out because that's just not feasible when the nation gets to be, as large as it's going to get and distributed over the land that it's going to be in. So these rules are meant to be principle-based consistent rules, but that doesn't mean that they are absolute in the sense of there being no exceptions, no situations in which something else trumps those rules. And it's a mistake to think otherwise. So,
Do you think that a lot of them just totally missed the point, and that maybe when God set up this Sabbath day and it was tied, he brought up the fact that he created everything in 6 days, that, he's wanting us to remember that he created us. He gave us everything. He gave us our ability to work. He gave us everything that we are comes from him, and all of our abilities, all of our things we have, everything comes from him. And we're supposed to be grateful to him and thank him for being our creator and for taking care of us and doing that. He's always wanted us to be thankful, and most of the time, all the Israelites did out in the wilderness was complain. And he does not like it when you complain, because you're complaining against him. And we do the same thing today. We are supposed to remember that all of our gifts and blessings come from him, and we kind of just take it for granted and think we're doing all this stuff on our own.
Right.
We're not. And I think sometimes everybody misses the point. It's not all about the resting. It's remembering God on those days and remembering where we come from, and that he has created us and he is our Lord and things.
yeah. I do think that a lot of them miss that point. A lot of us miss that point as well. I think that it's always kind of interesting when we read the scriptures, because the stories of the scriptures are mostly dealing with exceptional people, good and bad. The story of Tom, the guy who goes to work and celebrates the Sabbath and sacrifices and does a good job, but doesn't rout any giants or defeat any armies or cheat on his wife and kill somebody or whatever else it is. He doesn't show up in the Bible because he's not that interesting. The stories are about the interesting people. Whether it's David or Ahab, it's interesting people who've done interesting things that are designed to be lessons in part for us. And so I think one of the things that we always have to be sort of mindful of is that just because the Israelites overall did a pretty terrible job of honoring God, that we don't want to fall into the trap that Elijah did when he went up on Mount Carmel and had the competition against the prophets of Baal and Asherah and won, and then one threat from Jezebel left him fleeing to the mountains, where he says to God, "I'm the only one left who serves you." What was God's response? Anybody remember?
We got 7,000 left.
That's right, I've got 7,000. Now, that's not a big number considering how big Israel was at that point, but it's still 7,000, So we want to remember that there are, my guess is there were lots of Israelites who got it. There were lots of Israelites who understood it, and not just Moses and the people he was directly related to, but there were lots of people who did. The majority of them probably didn't, but lots of them did, because that's just how it tends to work. Statistics say that some of any group is going to tend to fall into one major category or another. And so it's almost certain that some of them did, but as you say, most of them didn't. Just like today, even though we talk more about it, even though some of the things that you said, are the nuances and the informed version of that understanding of what the Sabbath is about, in many ways are a derivation of the modern day Christian movement, or Messianic movement, in the case of the Messianic Jews. Nevertheless, we still don't practice it a lot. We talk about it. We say, oh, this is what it really meant. God was asking him to be, humble and thankful and everything else. And boy, God, I'd really like a new car, and I'm kind of irritated that you haven't given one to me yet, And we have these preachers who get up and do these, the prosperity gospels and stuff like that, where all they're talking about is how God will give you stuff and how you get stuff from God and physical material things. And that's all they talk about and all they think about. And those same people, if you ask them, are going to tell you pretty much what you just said, right? That we should be thankful and we should be grateful and everything else. But thankfulness and gratefulness do not come with give me more, give me more, give me more, give me more. You can't be thankful and grateful at the same time that you're just constantly saying, I want more. You have to stop sometimes and say, wait a minute, I don't just want more, I also want to be thankful for what I've got, which is supposedly enough according to that guy Jesus who we're supposed to be following. So All right, we got to stop. We're a little bit over time, and also I'm going to stop because this dovetails directly into my lesson, and that's just perfect. So thank you for tossing that softball up for me right there without even knowing it. I mean, that's really impressive. So
Well, he says we're supposed to be thankful in all circumstances, and that means the good and bad.
that's right.